All right, welcome. Thank you for tuning in. And I want to thank Donna for inviting me to speak today on this important topic. We are, we have grown up, our people, all of us, all the animals and humans and everybody in the planet has grown up in an environment of electromagnetic radiation that we have gotten from the sun, but also from the earth. So the sun has kind of beam this radiation at us, but we are surrounded by this envelope of protection, and only certain frequencies are penetrating that envelope and hitting the earth. And we know, of course, light is what we are able to see of the spectrum, and we get heat in the form of infrared energy. A little bit of ultraviolet blue comes in, but that's pretty much it. We don't get radio waves from the sun, and we don't get ionizing radiation. So I just wanted to show this slide to illustrate the interplay between the sun and the magnetosphere. Let's see here. So people think, oh, we're being surrounded by EMF. They see all these cell phones and these towers, smart utility meters. They're everywhere you look now, you see antennas. And the truth is, we aren't really being surrounded, we're being infiltrated, because the radiation coming from these towers isn't stopping at our skin surface, it's actually going through our bodies. And so even though the term infiltration is typically used for gases or for liquids, this is energy infiltration. So what is it? It's a series of waves that are composed of both magnetic and electrical components, and that's why they're called electromagnetic waves. And they travel at the speed of light. So they're off axis with one another by 90 degrees. So in this Giphy here, the blue waves represent the magnetic fields, and the red waves represent the electric fields. Now, the difference between different forms of electromagnetic radiation have to do with the frequency. And so this chart here is the electromagnetic spectrum, and it goes basically from direct current, where you have no oscillation, to gamma radiation. And you can see the wavelength in the middle of this chart keeps becoming faster and faster with a higher frequency. So on the left side of this chart, we have extremely low frequencies, which we are getting from our electrical wiring. Then the next level up, we have low frequency, or in the kilohertz range. We're calling that now dirty electricity, and we're getting those frequencies from our dimmer switches and some appliances and from smart meters now. And wireless communication is being provided by the radio wave bandwidth, which we'll define a little bit in a little bit. But beyond that, we have microwaves, infrared radiation. The visible light spectrum you can see is this little sliver where the rainbow is in this diagram. Beyond that, we have ultraviolet and X-rays. Now, what's interesting is the physicists believe that anything below what's considered ionizing radiation, or about midway through the ultraviolet spectrum, is safe, in that the energy in the wave isn't strong enough to knock an electron out of an atom's orbit. And so it can't physically cause a damage to an atom. But what we've learned in biology is that we can have similar effects even if it's non-ionizing radiation on the left side of the spectrum. And we know from experience that visible light, for example, causes a lot of biological effects. The only reason we're here on Earth is because our plants are able to use light energy to undergo photosynthesis to create sugar. So obviously non-ionizing radiation can have biological effects. Also, the fact that we can see is because light is interacting with the cells in our retina and causing chemical reactions that are then allowing us to see. So to say that non-ionizing radiation doesn't have any biological effects just would be, incorrect. So what's the difference between all these different wavelengths is the the frequency changes. So all of this radiation travels at the speed of light. And the difference between the different frequencies is, I'm sorry, if you look at these two oscillations here, the blue one represents a longer wavelength and the orange one is a shorter wavelength. So if you imagine that they're both traveling from left to right in this range, and it takes 1 second, the blue wavelength would travel and undergo 4 cycles in 1 second, whereas the orange wavelength would travel 7 cycles. So the orange wavelength has a higher frequency. Higher frequencies transmit more energy. So it's going to be a little bit more important later, but I just want you to understand that all of this stuff travels at the same speed. The difference has to do with the frequency. Now, radio frequency radiation is a broad spectrum of bandwidth of frequencies, and it goes from 100 kilohertz approximately to 300 gigahertz, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, humans have figured out how to modulate this information and transmit information on it, on these frequencies. And this is a diagram that I created going from 50 to 60 hertz, which, like I mentioned earlier, is the frequency emitting from power lines. But starting at 600 kilohertz, we have AM radio. Then we had, that should say MRI, TV, FM radio. All of them, the pinkish boxes represent mobile communications, so cell phones, 2G, 3G, 4G, and 5G is the one that's the longest. Then we have smart meters, Bluetooth, cordless phones, and Wi-Fi. Radar is the green one over there on the right. Now, I want you to look. The top left is AM radio, and you'll see that is really going only from 540 kilohertz to 1700 kilohertz, and so that represents 1,160,000 frequencies. Now compare that to the bandwidth of 5G, which actually is composed of two bandwidths, but that represents 34 billion different frequencies. So if you remember turning an old AM radio dial, it might be that you turn it 6 times and you get from one end of the bandwidth to the other. With 5G, you would have to turn that dial 176,000 times to represent the bandwidth using a dial. That's how enormous the bandwidth is. That's what they call the broadband. But in any case, the frequencies, as we increase the frequencies, the power and the intensity of the radiation increases. I also want you to note that microwave ovens, what's going on here? Microwave ovens are also at the same frequency, 2.45 gigahertz, as your Bluetooth, cordless phones, Wi-Fi routers. The difference is that it is just a simple sine wave and it's not modulated. So how is information transmitted with this radiation? You have differences in frequency, but how is the information actually transmitted? Well, it has to do with altering the actual shape of the wave. Just like with an instrument, if you have, let's say, the flute and the guitar and a violin playing the same note, say an A, you would be able to recognize that they are all different instruments because the actual sound is the frequency is the same, but the shape of the wave is different, and that gives the sound its character, and it's called modulation. So the same thing can be done with electromagnetic radiation. If you look at the top sine wave, that's a simple wave. That would be the kind of radiation coming, let's say, through a microwave oven. But if we then change the shape of the wave, we don't change the frequency, but we kind of put information on that wave, we can transmit it from one place to another. And if we increase the frequency, since they're traveling at the same speed of light, the higher frequency will transmit more information in the same amount of time. That's why the industry keeps trying to increase the frequency. Now, the information isn't being transmitted consistently, there are gaps. It's called pulsation. So the network is called up to transmit information. You get a pulse of information, then there's a dead spot. Then it gets called up to transmit some more information, then another dead spot. So that's called pulsation. And the combination of pulsation and modulation has a greater biological impact than, say, the simple sine wave emitted than a simple sine wave. The radiation has different characteristics. It can be absorbed, it can penetrate, and it can reflect. It can also scatter. So if you imagine if this was a room and this yellow figure on the left represented a radiation source, we're going to say a Wi-Fi router, all the places where I've got these red dots represent areas where the radiation can be absorbed. So it happens at an interface. Uh, when when the radiation uh, then when the radiation passes through things, it can then penetrate. We know that that happens because if you turn on your your cell phone, then you might pick up your neighbor's Wi-Fi on your cell phone, or even two neighbors down. So we know that the radiation from the Wi-Fi is penetrating through their home, through your body perhaps, and then to your cell phone so you can pick it up. The radiation is also reflected. So the combination of all this leads to basically an environment that is completely inundated with radiation. So what emits this radiation? Anything that communicates wirelessly. This list is kind of old now, but it's still relevant. The smart homes have security systems, thermostats, lights, appliances. These smart utility meters are using radio frequency radiation to communicate with the parent companies. People are walking around with AirPods and Bluetooth devices in their ears. These virtual reality headsets, cordless phones, cell phones, and the list goes on and on. And they're adding more and more every year. There's more and more devices. So what happens when you turn one of these devices on or you leave it on? It creates this field that permeates, like I showed in that previous diagram, and you have others in the house doing the same thing. So you end up with overlapping fields of radiation in your home. They pass through the floors, they pass through the ceilings, the walls, and so the difference is really about intensity at that point. The closer that you are to a source, the more intense the radiation is going to be. So this is another diagram that I drew. The darker blue represents a wave that is less intense, and the lighter blue is more intense. As we increase the intensity, we increase the ability of the radiation to pass through structures. And as we increase the intensity, more energy is transferred through absorption. So intensity is one of the things that we need to pay attention to, and it's also called power density when we're talking about radio frequency radiation. The intensity decreases with the square of the distance. So if you have a router, a cell phone, any type of emitter, as you increase your distance, you double your distance from the source, your radiation exposure is going to decrease by 4 times. The units are typically volts per meter or microwatts per meter squared or microwatts per centimeter squared. It just depends on the equipment you're using and what the application is. Now we know that electromagnetic radiation causes heating. That's how the microwave works. So at a certain intensity, the radiation will actually cause, through absorption, the tissue to heat. And that is what is being looked at by regulators. So this was the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, ICNIRP, set up guidelines for radiofrequency radiation, and they're only considering increases in temperature for their limits. And so these were some of the specifics. I don't want to go into it because it's complicated. But let's just say in the United States, the FCC is allowing a SAR, which is a specific absorption rate of 1.6 watts per kilogram, which is high. That's a lot of radiation. And there are exposure limits for different countries. This was from a paper that was done by an author, Mordikev, from Russia. he showed that this was just a list in his paper showing that different countries in Western Europe and the US have the highest intensity limits that we allow, and it's 10 watts per meter squared. That would be equivalent to 10 million microwatts per meter squared. So if we were looking at a detector, which we'll talk about in a little bit, uh, 10 million microwatts per meter squared is the exposure limit in the United States. Compare that to Russia, where it's 0.1 or 100,000 microwatts per meter squared, and Bulgaria is the lowest at 10,000. Now, this picture was going around the internet for a while, and a lot of people thought that this represented heat. This is what happens to the brain when a cell phone is put next to it. The image on the left is a 5-year-old child, then a 10-year-old, and to the right is an adult. These are images from a PET scan. And what a PET scan shows is it shows glucose metabolism, or the activity of the brain. So this shows that when a cell phone is applied to a person's ear, there is a metabolic effect to the brain. So there's an increase and that's caused by absorption of the radiation into the brain. And because the child's skull is the thinnest, the radiation can have an effect even beyond the midline. So we have people in our culture that are putting these cell phones right up to their ear, and there was some concern about, well, are these causing brain tumors? The industry was saying no. They had some research out there that was saying that it wasn't, but a lot of other studies have shown that there is an increase in tumors on the same side of the head that people are putting their cell phones. And this was an expert report for a case, Murray versus Motorola in 2021. And this scientist, Christopher Portier, said that in his opinion, RF exposure probably causes gliomas and neuromas, which are brain tumors. And given the human, animal, and experimental evidence, he asserts to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that the probability that RF exposure causes these tumors is high. And I agree. So the International Agency for Research on Cancer, the IARC, classified this radiation as a group 2B, as a possible human carcinogen. And from what I understand, they're thinking about bumping it up to a probable human carcinogen. So that's kind of in process. Now, as a radiologist, I was trained in radiation physics. And what I learned about radiation is that it has two types of effects. There's a deterministic effect, which is predictable, meaning that you give a certain amount of exposure and you're going to have a predictable effect, cause and effect. So this image on the left is typical. Somebody lays out in the sun too long, they're going to get a sunburn. That's a deterministic effect. A stochastic effect, on the other hand, is seemingly random. And that would be like this image on the right, developing a melanoma. If you lay out in the sun, you're not necessarily going to get a melanoma, but we know that the increased risk of melanoma increases with your increasing exposure. And so that's kind of how radiation goes. It's not, there are deterministic effects that are reproducible, but unfortunately, there are a lot of effects that are not necessarily reproducible, but they still happen and they increase, the incidence increases with increasing exposure. So just to kind of tie this in with EMF, the deterministic effect would be heating. So as you increase the exposure, you're going to have increased heating, which is what they're looking at in terms of regulation. The stochastic effects, like brain tumors and all that, they can't really. They'll just say, well, it's not reproducible, it's not proven. Now, how do we know that X-rays cause cancer? We know that X-rays cause cancer because really of what happened with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There was a huge population exposed to radiation, and we were able to tell based on how far they were from the blast site that they received a certain amount of radiation, and a certain percentage of the population got cancer. And so that's how we were able to really decide or determine what rates were safe of exposure and what rates weren't. And this is, again, ionizing radiation, but the concept is applicable to non-ionizing radiation as well. So in radiology, we talk about as low as reasonably achievable, or ALARA, and that's really what I believe we should consider for non-ionizing radiation as well. So how does this radiation affect our health? How can it possibly affect cells? It's just energy. Well, this was a study done by Martin Paul, and what he suggests is that the electromagnetic fields are actually activating voltage-gated calcium channels. And what that means is that they're causing calcium to flood into the cell. And when calcium floods into a cell, it causes the cell to undergo stress. And that stress reaction causes the production of something called reactive oxygen species. But basically, if you just understand that the cell becomes stressed in the presence of these electromagnetic fields, that suffices. Now, this is a diagram of the biochemistry. Basically, the microwaves end up causing something called free radicals, or the reactive oxygen species, and oxidative stress. And that can lead to a dysfunction of the mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of the cell. It can cause pathophysiological effects of the cell in other ways. And it can also cause therapeutic effects if it's in certain conditions. So it's not all bad. Sometimes microwaves and electromagnetic radiation can have a positive effect, but not in the way that we're all being exposed. So if your cell goes under oxidative stress, what can happen to it? That's what we really need to understand. Well, what oxidative stress is, and this is where unfortunately, this talk is kind of brief, and I don't have time to go into all of this in detail. It's really involved. But basically, these reactive oxygen species are missing an electron, and so they're looking to gain an electron from something else in the cell. If they take it from the cell membrane can become damaged. If they get the electron from a protein or an enzyme, that enzyme might become dysfunctional. They can get the electron from DNA, and then that can cause mutagenesis, or the cell can become cancerous. They can get the electron from mitochondria, and then they can end up with something called mitochondrial dysfunction, where the mitochondria doesn't function properly, and the cell doesn't utilize energy properly. So these are all very kind of non-specific. They're specific for the cell, but they're not specific for the entire organism. So we need to kind of figure out, well, what's at risk? So if your whole body is being exposed to radiation, how do you know, well, what part of your body is really at risk? Does it really depend on the location that your router is, your cell phone? What about carrying it in your pocket versus putting it in your bag? The risks really have to do with the depth of penetration of the radiation. And the depth of penetration has to do with the frequency. So we mentioned that higher frequencies are associated with more energy, but they have less depth of penetration. Lower frequencies have greater depth of penetration. Higher intensities cause a greater depth of penetration. And that's why when we have these 4G and 5G towers around our neighborhoods, they're providing a much higher intensity. And so there's going to provide greater depth of penetration through our homes and through our bodies. If we increase the distance from the radiation source, that lowers the intensity, as we mentioned. Tissue characteristics also affect the depth of penetration. Some tissues are more able to let the radiation pass through, and others can attenuate it. Now, this was a report that came out in 2012 that showed that this radiation can have all kinds of systemic effects. It can affect your endocrine system, your reproductive system. It can affect the brain and cause neuropsychiatric disorders. It can affect the immune system, metabolism. It can have cardiac effects, blood abnormalities, and of course, it can cause cancer, as we mentioned. So this is not something that is going to necessarily just affect one body part. It can affect the whole organism. Now I'm going to just talk about a couple of different specifics just to kind of drive home the point. The first is the thyroid gland, very superficial structure. It's in your neck. This ultrasound on the bottom right, just to show you that in this person, the thyroid gland was only 6 millimeters deep. So it's a very, very radiosensitive gland. And the thyroid is important. And a couple of studies have shown that microwave exposure to the thyroid gland can affect the function of it. This one study by a baby showed that the TSH values in somebody exposed to the radiation went up. Another person had a thyroid, not another person, another study showed thyroid gland insufficiency. This study at the bottom showed, it was done in medical students and showed that after 2 months of using a cell phone, these medical students who were supposed to be healthy ended up having thyroid hyperstimulation. Now, in my own family, I had a sister, or have a sister, and she contacted me several years ago, and now this was actually many years ago. She was diagnosed with hyperthyroidism, and she wanted to know what I thought she should do. And I said, well, go to the endocrinologist and see what they have to say. And so she did. They repeated the testing, and she was hyperthyroid. They wanted her to have either an ablation with radioactive iodine or to have surgery to cut it out. And they were going to give her Synthroid for the rest of her life. And I was, as I was working in a community where it just seemed like everybody was having thyroid disease, it just seemed incredibly, that the prevalence was increasing beyond what I thought was reasonable. And I knew there was an environmental component to this. And so I said to her, I just thought, is your Wi-Fi router in your bedroom by chance? And she said, yes. And I said, I want you to move it down to the basement. Don't do anything with the endocrinologist yet. Just move your Wi-Fi router down to the basement and turn it off at night, and let's see if your values come down. So she waited a couple of months after doing that, had her thyroid retested, and it was normal. And it was normal for many, many years until she moved into a 55 plus community where she then became exposed to her neighbor's Wi-Fi, and her thyroid became abnormal again. So it was just kind of an anecdotal story, but relevant. Now, the thyroid has a lot of functions. It affects your immune system. It can affect your heart. Abnormal thyroid can cause arrhythmias. And yeah, it's not just the thyroid that becomes affected. The thyroid produces hormones that affect the rest of your body. For men that carry a cell phone in their pocket, studies have shown that cell phone radiation can decrease sperm count, reduce mobility, and viability. So there's a lot of data about this now. So yeah, people should not carry a cell phone in their pocket, especially men who are trying to have children. Neuropsychiatric symptoms. This is very disturbing. Insomnia, sleep disturbance. How many people do you know that can't sleep anymore? Headaches, visual disturbance, short-term memory loss, dementia, tremor sensation, dizziness and vertigo, tinnitus. Also, it seems like everybody has tinnitus these days. So these are some symptoms that have been associated with EMF exposure. Insomnia is an important one, and the same thing happens with light. But there's a tract in the brain called the retinohypothalamic tract, and it goes from your eyes to the brain, and it tells your brain whether or not it's light outside. Because as I mentioned, our eyes are seeing light, but light is electromagnetic radiation. We're only supposed to be seeing electromagnetic radiation when the sun is out in the sky. And the other half of the night, we're supposed to be in darkness. And so that's the part of the day where our brain goes into repair mode and we produce melatonin, and it helps improve the function, and it repairs damage that happened during the day to the body. But if you expose yourself to light or radiofrequency radiation at night, your brain thinks that the sun's still out in the sky, and it delays or inhibits the production of melatonin. And that's probably why so many people are taking melatonin supplements now. There is evidence that radiofrequency radiation can affect cardiac rhythm, especially with the new 5G antennas and the 4G LTE. In some of these towns, I've heard an increase in people with atrial fibrillation. When I first started practicing medicine, atrial fibrillation was pretty rare. Very few people had pacemakers. This study here in the middle, atrial fibrillation, the current epidemic, there is an epidemic of atrial fibrillation. As we all know, even our, our, uh, our lieutenant governor had atrial fibrillation. So this is affecting a large swath of the population. It hasn't been proven yet, but this one study that I thought was interesting on the bottom right, low levels of electromagnetic fields and attenuate the inducibility of atrial fibrillation, meaning why I find that interesting is it means that it does have an effect on cardiac rhythm. So moving on, neurological and behavioral dysfunction, anxiety. So many people now are anxious. EMF can cause anxiety in mice and in guinea pigs. There's also been an association with increased depression. So, all these kids that are constantly on their phones, and many of them are sleeping with their phones, they have all this anxiety and depression, they're on medication. We were blaming Facebook and Instagram because of the content. My personal belief is it's probably not the content as so much as it is the carrier signals, that it's all this radiation that they're being hyperstimulated, and then they end up with depression because that's the natural course of events. Cognitive fog, loss of memory, decreased concentration, and I hope I'm hoping that you heard about Havana syndrome. The last group of people I spoke to, nobody had heard of Havana syndrome. It's something that was being reported on, that our diplomats were experiencing these same symptoms. And people thought, oh, it's the Russians, it's other countries are doing this, that it's some type of warfare or some type of malicious intent. I really think that other countries don't have the same, they don't have the same, it's not the regulation, but the same maintenance, or they don't pay the same attention to the detail of what the emissions are. And I think the people were getting toxic from this exposure. What was interesting, in the Wall Street Journal, they said some likely, some Havana syndrome cases are likely caused by electromagnetic waves. I have a feeling they all are. So the impact of intracellular calcium and oxidative stress can also affect viruses, and this is interesting because, of course, now we're seeing more viruses come on the scene. But increased intracellular calcium and oxidative stress can result in easier viral entry into a cell. They also facilitate viral replication and release. And there was a study by San Juan and Delap. They talked about a lot of different factors that increased the viral mutation rate, but oxidative stress is one of them. So my question was, did RFR exacerbate the COVID-19 pandemic? And I wrote a paper with the biophysicist in San Francisco addressing this concern, and it was published in peer-reviewed literature. So if you're interested, I can send you a link to that. But unfortunately, we're now seeing monkeypox, and then they're talking about polio. Could the same mechanisms of increased intracellular calcium and oxidative stress from Wi-Fi be worsening these other outbreaks? There's nothing to say that it's specific to COVID-19. There really could be, one viral outbreak after the other if our immune systems are being compromised and the viruses are being enhanced by the presence of this radiation. Scary. So I just want to show you a couple of maps here, just to kind of drive home the point. The top left was the world population, and the bottom right was the global distribution of COVID at the end of December 2020. And you'll see they don't really correlate too well. You can see there's a lot of COVID in the western part of the United States, where the population is small, and Africa has a very large population, but had very low COVID. And Southeast Asia also, a lot of people there, very little COVID. So I would say that there was not a real strong correlation between population and the distribution of COVID. But if you look at this map on the top left, this was obtained from a website called Weigel.net, and they show all the Wi-Fi and networks and Bluetooth around the globe, and you can dial in whatever date you want. But this was December 2019, and to correlate that with the distribution of COVID earlier during the pandemic, on April 7th, 2020, and you'll see that the correlation is striking, really amazing. Now, most people exposed to EMF don't have any symptoms, but there is a subset of the population, up to 5%, that can have what's called hypersensitivity, and they really are having trouble functioning. Some people are living in cars, trying to go from place to place to just get away from this. The symptoms are listed here. Some of them we've already talked about. This is terrible that people can't live in their towns anymore because they're being attacked really by this energy that they can't escape. It's not like having something outside that can't penetrate through your house. If you have an antenna outside, there's no way to protect yourself from it. You can't close the door. You can't put up soundproofing, and it's very, very hard to shield an entire house from these frequencies. So what can we do? Well, there's a few things we can do to help. The first is to take antioxidants. I don't believe that it's possible to really live in a city or a town with all these antennas and use a cell phone and all these things and subsist on just eating fruits and vegetables anymore. I really think people are going to have to start taking vitamin C, vitamin E, other antioxidants. They help provide the electrons that are missing when the calcium goes into the cell and there's this formation of the reactive oxygen species. So I think that people are going to need to take supplements. Vitamin D is also very beneficial, and magnesium is something that people may need to start increasing their intake of. There's an association of coronary artery spasm and diminished magnesium in people who are getting too much exposure to this radiofrequency radiation. So that's another thing to consider. We need to reduce our exposure any way we can. So, it just means turning off devices when you're not using them. At home, I've hardwired my computers, my TVs. I don't use Wi-Fi anymore in my house, and I don't miss it at all, really. It's important to distance yourself as much as possible from emitters if you have them and you use them. Use your cell phone consciously, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And survey your environment to uncover hidden sources of exposure you may or may not realize you're being exposed to daily. Now, these smartphones, this is a screen from an Apple phone. They have a lot of different antennas. It's not just the antenna. It's not one antenna that's providing your ability to talk and do Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and all that. They're all different antennas beaming at different frequencies, and you can turn each of them off. So, for example, this image with the two blue circles, the one with the Wi-Fi symbol and the one with the Bluetooth symbol, in that state, I've got the cellular antenna functioning, the Wi-Fi antenna is functioning, and the Bluetooth antenna is functioning. Maybe I just want to use my phone for text messages and emails, and I don't need to hook into Wi-Fi, and I don't need to use Bluetooth. So you can turn those off, which I did in the image to the right. I turned off the Wi-Fi, I turned off the Bluetooth. Now I'm being exposed to two less antennas than I was before. I do that every day. This is how I use my phone. And when I'm not using my phone, if I'm carrying it from one place to another, I put it in airplane mode. I don't put a live phone in my pocket. And I don't feel like I need to be at anyone's beck and call 24/7. So when I head to bed, my phone is turned off. So how else can we use the cell phone in a healthier way? I always use it with speakerphone. I never put the cell phone up to my ear. And I don't use Bluetooth devices. The ear, it's a canal through bone, and there's a very thin piece of bone that separates your ear from your brain. So by putting a Bluetooth or any other device into your ear, you're actually delivering that radiofrequency radiation right into the brain. So I don't recommend that. Don't carry your live cell phone in a pocket or in a bra, as I mentioned. Turn off the antennas you're not using. And I say, put the cell phone in airplane mode whenever you can. Detecting radiation requires using a detector. And this was a complicated slide. I apologize for that. But just look in the bottom two detectors. One's called Safe and Sound Pro 2, and the other's Acousticom. Those are designed to measure radio frequency radiation in the bandwidth from 200 megahertz to 8 gigahertz. I personally use the one called Safe and Sound Pro 2, and it's decent. There are a lot of different detectors on the market. The really inexpensive ones, they're probably not worth it. They're probably not accurate. This is a sophisticated part. It's a sophisticated piece of equipment. Uh, it really needs to function properly and be tuned so that it performs correctly. And anyway, so the Safe and Sound Pro 2 I know is a good one. So I prepared a couple of videos just to illustrate this, and we'll get through it quickly. Okay, so now we're in my house, and I'd like you to understand that I kind of went back in time and put back a lot of EMF producing gadgets into the house that I had gotten rid of subsequently to help you understand the process that I went through to clear this out. So we're going to put the EMF detector on, and I'm going to show you that in this foyer here, we're getting maximum readings around 14,000, and the peak readings are somewhere between 2,500 and 4,000. I should stop first and say background is 0. So 14,000 is high. It's very, very high. We're going to talk about more numbers later, but yeah, background is 0. On a recent trip to Africa, I brought my survey detector, and I was measuring out in the savannah, and it was 0. There was no radiation at all. So this is not a natural occurring thing. I'm going to turn this louder. Do you hear that jackhammer sound? That's characteristic of a Wi-Fi router. In this room, we have our Wi-Fi router. And you'll see that we're getting maximum readings of 176,000 microwatts per meter squared, and our peaks are anywhere from 86 to 100,000. So again, very, very high readings from the router, but that's right in front of it. The easiest way to get rid of the EMF from the Wi-Fi router is just to switch it off. I'm going to reset this. Our peak readings now are 2,710, which is coming from other sources. Now in this room, we happen to have a cordless phone. The base station is continuously communicating with the satellite phones, and you'll see it's constantly emitting electromagnetic fields. So if I was working at this desk, I'd be blasted with EMF the whole time I was sitting here. So you'll see we're getting maximum readings now of 275,000 microwatts per meter squared, and the peak right now is about 16 to 17,000. And you'll see if I unplug this, it instantly goes off. Now we're getting maximums of 26, 29, and a peak of somewhere between 21 and 29. So it doesn't have to be. All you got to do is turn this stuff off, and you're much in a much cleaner environment. So I used to tell people what you could do with your Wi-Fi router is just put it on a timer, and that way at least it's off while you're sleeping. I don't do that anymore, partly because the cable company, they're constantly sending updates, and if you want to use your router in the morning and you've had it off all night, it takes maybe 15, 20 minutes for it to reboot and get the updates. So what I did is I went onto my cable website, and you can turn off the hotspot and the Wi-Fi capability on your website, your access point to the cable company, and then you can connect your router to another Wi-Fi router that you can turn on and off if you need one. And so what I now do is I have data ports that are dropped around different parts of the house, and Ethernet cables connect the Wi-Fi router to the data ports. And so I plug in my TV, I plug in my computer, just like we used to do before Wi-Fi. And it's great. So I don't have Wi-Fi anymore in the house at all, unless somebody comes in and asks for it for some reason. Yeah, so that's how I deal with it now. I don't use any Wi-Fi. I also suggest you use a corded landline at home if you've got a cell phone, to just not use one of those mobile phone systems. What happens is the base system is always communicating with the satellite phones, as I mentioned in the video, and so the base system in particular is pretty notorious for emitting strong EMF. I also suggest people hardwire their peripherals, their keyboard, the mouse, the printer. There's really no reason to have Wi-Fi with these peripherals, and I'll just show you another quick demo. So this is a wireless keyboard, a wireless mouse rather. And so even though you can't feel this, you can't hear it without the detector, it's still kind of hitting you periodically with this constant pulse of EMF. Now, sleeping is an important part, as we mentioned, because of the melatonin production. They recommend that in the sleeping area, your RF exposure should be below 10 microwatts per meter squared, and achieving that now is very, very difficult. So what I do now is I have the sleep canopy, and here's one more video just to show you, what it does. So I wanted to bring you up to my bedroom here to introduce the concept of a sleep sanctuary to you. When I first moved into the city, I had a very hard time sleeping, and I found that it was because of all the ambient EMF in the atmosphere here. There's a power line outside the front of the house, which I'll show you in a bit. There's also the Wi-Fi router for the neighbor to the left of me, the Wi-Fi router to the neighbor to the right of me, and we had a Wi-Fi router downstairs that was active at the time. And in any case, I wasn't able to sleep, and so I ended up purchasing this EMF shielding canopy. It looks like mosquito netting, but it actually it repels or reflects a radio frequency radiation, and I found that's tremendously helpful. So I'm going to just do a demonstration for you. So right now in this room, without any sort of shielding, I'm getting a maximum value of 5,110, and the peaks range from 120 up to 5,000. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to show you how this is reduced with the canopy. Okay, so now we're inside the sleep canopy, and you'll notice that it's fully sealed, which is important because the EMF can refract, it can scatter, and every little crack has to be sealed. I use these clips. And you'll see on our detector, we have a blinking green light, which is good. Now it's solid, but we have a green light, which is good. The peak value we're getting is around 1.04, and the maximum value we've gotten is 4.7, which is a little bit higher than 3. Less than 3 is ideal, but still there's been a significant improvement than without the sleep canopy. I'm able to sleep with this. I'm not able to sleep without it, at least in the city, and I highly recommend this if you or your patients have trouble sleeping. So yeah, before I moved into the city, I lived out in a town called Murraysville, and I was on 7 acres. And when I turned off my Wi-Fi router, my background was 3, which was fine. I didn't need a sleep canopy. But when I moved into the city, because I was surrounded by all these neighbors that had Wi-Fi, it was up to, in the thousands. So I had to buy this. but it's fine now. I can sleep. So what's different about 5G? I'm sure you've all seen these antennas everywhere. They're just popping up absolutely everywhere. This is a church down the road from my house. The uh, the long skinny ones are emitting 4G LTE, and the square ones are the 5G antennas. The 4G antennas are emitting frequency 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And what's concerning about them is that because they're in our neighborhoods now, the intensity is much greater than if they were out of town, or on a hillside somewhere. So the intensity of the radiation is much stronger than it used to be. The 5G antennas have much, much higher frequencies, even into the millimeter wave, which is kind of like the radiation that you're being exposed to when you go through security testing at the airport and they put you through the millimeter scanner. Um, Except that the exposure is much longer if you're downloading something. But these 5G frequencies are supposedly only being emitted when your phone or your tablet or device is trying to call up and download something quickly. So it's supposed to be an on-demand system. So the intensity of the radiation is great and the frequency is very, very high, which is a little scary, but it's on demand. So you're not being exposed to it 24/7. And if you don't have one of these devices in your presence, you really shouldn't be exposed at all. So my understanding is they're trying to phase out the 4G antennas and go mainly with 5G, and they're going to have these satellites beaming down radiation. It's really a lot to think about, and it's complicated, and I don't have time to go into it, and I really don't understand it totally myself. But it's a process, and it's in process. But that's what we're dealing with right now is 4G and 5G. Now, I did do an experiment. First, I was working with scientist Magda Havis from California, from Toronto, and she's doing an international study looking at the exposure that people have on main streets all around the world. And I did a mini survey for Pennsylvania. I went to 35 different cities and towns during the fall of 2021, and I surveyed Main Street and just to see, what towns had 5G, what the intensity levels were walking down the street. And this is just some of the data that I got from this study. The highest max intensity readings I got were in Gettysburg. I got 55,270 microwatts per meter squared. That's standing on a street corner in Gettysburg. That's really intense. There was an intensity, I'm sorry, that was not standing on a street corner. That was the average for the entire town, for the main street. The highest corner was in Indiana, as I mentioned earlier, on the corner of 6th Street and Philadelphia Street, and I got a maximum intensity of 259,000 microwatts per meter squared. And that's whole body exposure. And that's because the antenna was about a block and a half away on top of a building. So I thought that was really amazing, incredible exposure. Compare that to Phoenixville, which had the lowest max intensity of 47 microwatts per meter squared. So they don't have any 5G there. So there's a huge discrepancy in the exposures in these different towns. The conclusion of my paper was that the presence of 5G and 4G LTE networks are associated with higher EMF, radio frequency levels, with few exceptions. If the small cells are placed on utility poles, they're associated with the highest exposure levels to pedestrians. Antenna placement on the buildings are generally less intense, but still much higher than with older networks. And this paper is finished, and I've submitted it to a journal. They just rejected it because I've got to make a few changes, but hopefully I'll find a home for it. So where do we stand? Well, there was this Environmental Health Trust versus FCC lawsuit that they won in appellate court on August 16th, 2021. I haven't heard of anything happening since this verdict. I don't know where it stands. I went to the Environmental Health Trust website before speaking today, and I didn't see any updates. But I'm hoping that the FCC is going to review all of the research that's been done in the last 30 years and to kind of update what's safe, because they're a captured agency, and they haven't really been they've just been in doing whatever the industry has asked them to do, and hopefully this lawsuit will make some change. So, recommended reading. There's some good books out there. The Invisible Rainbow by Arthur Furstenberg was really interesting. If you have an interest in this topic, it's a long book, but really complete, and I thought it was excellent. The Body Electric by Robert Becker is also really good. It talks about the fact that we are electromagnetic beings. To think that we're a bag of chemicals is just not really accurate. Those chemicals are being orchestrated by energy. And so the fact that we're being infiltrated by all this energy really is, it's important to understand. There's a book about dirty electricity, which we didn't talk about today, by Samuel Milham, which is really good. And here's some online resources. And that's what I got for you today. I do have a website if you're interested. I write a lot about EMF, but not exclusively about EMF. So if you're interested, you can check that out. And thank